A young immigrant to Canada discovers that love can be found in the most unlikely places. Andrew isn't the run-of-the-mill team captain. Can he show Will what it means to be in love? And can he coax the awkward, non-social boy out of the closet? Events spiral out of control after stolen kisses are caught, and gossip begins to spiral out of control. Chapter 1. Will was distracted. He was sitting as he always did, rushing at the last minute to get his homework done. He should have been concentrating on his work, he knew that, but it didn't seem quite as important at that moment. He was simply not into his work. Classic underachiever syndrome at work. He should have been the poster boy for it, except he wasn't attractive enough. Not that he was unattractive, quite the contrary. He was tall, dark and handsome, with careless hair and a pair of those deep hazel Irish eyes that drew people to trust him on instinct. But he was not hot. He had been told repeatedly that he looked too intelligent. He looked like a scruffy academic. Add 10 years to him and lose him in a museum and people would just assume he belonged. He was handsome in that classic Englishman manner that brimmed with raw charisma, but without the accent he was simply normal. Now Tom Cruise was hot, but Will was definitely no Tom Cruise. He shifted his hand to rest his chin on it, staring vacantly up at the doors to the library. He could play sports if he wanted to, nothing stopped him, except the fact that he just didn't know how to play most of them. He had grown up in England, a place where basketball, football and hockey weren't played. Hell, they were even laughed at back home. Will could play soccer modestly, but he had been an ace at cricket. Nothing like going from ace cricket rookie to geek because his father had wanted to emigrate. It sucked. There had been a rather embarrassing incident when he had tried out for the baseball team in the summer. He had stepped up to the plate feeling the awkward round bat in his hand and tried to swing for it, missing the first 2 times. The last time he had just relaxed, holding the bat like a cricket bat, and had connected hard enough to send the ball right out of the field, into the coach's Volvo. That had ended his sports career. Though it had bought him the respect of his friends who thought it was cool that at 16 Will could hit a home run and make it look effortless. Will started from his thoughts as Andrew Highmore walked into South Carleton High School's library with a smug expression that wasn't so much arrogant as it was confident. It was rare to have many guys willing to spend their study period in the library, especially not someone with Andrew Highmore's reputation. His green leather Letterman jacket only contained his threatening broad shoulders. And the gold lettering on the sleeve read Storm Hockey, a real sport in the coach's eyes, not like cricket. He grabbed the first seat available, which happened to be beside the tall windows that overlooked the ramp up to the main doors of the school. Honestly, this caught Will off guard. He would have assumed that Andrew would have placed himself out of sight, hidden away from his teammates in case they saw him there. Yet, he sat with an emanating confidence that confounded the instincts. He seemed like the type of guy that over-exaggerated every moan while working out in the gym. The type that fell asleep each night reading his own stats. He fished out a pair of reading glasses, also out of character, as he pushed his blonde hair away from his eyes. Andrew was tall, built for hockey in that typical Canadian way, and to Will he was definitely handsome in an Old Navy commercial kind of way. It made Andrew appear young, wholesome and clean-cut. He was the kind of boy girls could take home to meet their mother. He had sandy blonde hair, parted in the middle almost carelessly, which only served to add to the image of a typical wholesome youth. But it was Andrew's sharp blue eyes that gave Will a way to see past the stereotype to the intelligent and determined man beyond. Those powerful eyes that shone every time he spoke. Will shook his head as the bell rang for the start of the study period. Will went back to his own textbooks. His English paper was due later that afternoon, and typically he was leaving it until the last minute. But it wasn't a big deal for him. Much to his English teacher's frustration, he had an innate understanding of the English language, one that let him bang out an A-grade paper in less than an hour. He stared at the selections of William Blake. It was simple for Will to see where Blake was going with the poem. The tricky part was connecting it to his later works. Those were scattered about him in a disorganized pile waiting for his attention. There was something thrilling about being lost in the written word, and Will was enjoying himself. Hey, so long as it wasn't math, Will was happy to do the work. An innate understanding of math seemed to be one thing he lacked, much to his dad's dismay. Curiosity made him glance up and over to where Andrew sat, pencil clenched between his teeth as he flipped through a chemistry book. Of course. Mr. Chason had the senior chem labs that afternoon, a big deal apparently, though Will had yet to take any of Chason's courses, those came next semester. He considered opening up a conversation, but Andrew was too far away for that. And you didn't just start a conversation with the captain of the storm? Your English paper still isn't done? Lisa asked as she laid her books down on the table beside him. Late as ever, Will wondered if she would ever pull it together. She was a beautiful girl, there was a hint of the exotic in her appearance, a slight roundness to her face and the curliness to her dark hair that always made Will think of Helen of Troy. Men would destroy cities for that woman one day. Trouble with her was, she never realized it. He smiled up at her. It's just Blake, he said with a simple shrug of his shoulders. I give myself even odds to be done by the end of study hall. She snorted at him as she flipped open her own textbook and fished through her notes. I was done with that paper a week ago. That's because you're a keener. Will grinned as he returned his concentration to the paper and scribbled some more notes in his near-illegible handwriting. It was like painting a picture. First he got the basic shape for it, and from there he would fill out the details. Lisa stared at him a moment and reached out to pull his bald cap down over his eyes. Jerk. She said with a grin. Miss Harriet, the librarian, a wizened old spinster, admonished from the counter. She never even looked up from her book cataloging. Will grinned up at Lisa as he readjusted his cap on his head, shaking his head at his nemesis. I'm still going to score higher than you on this paper. Lisa looked down at it, then back up at him, and she gave him a radiant smile. And I am still scoring higher than you in math class, so we're even. She stopped when she noticed Andrew Highmore sitting over by the windows watching them. Is that? Will nodded. Yep, he replied as he continued to work. Chemistry lab this afternoon. She tapped her pen on the edge of the table. Glasses make him kinda cute. She shook her head as she caught herself checking out a jock and pulled out her calculator. I thought that you and Brody were. Will began. Don't even say it, she grumbled in frustration. He asked me out to the semi-formal this weekend, but hasn't shown up for school. His friend Jeff said the last he heard Brody was off buying a motorbike. Like school isn't important or anything. The guy just won't grow up. Will relaxed in the uncomfortable plastic chair that was supposedly designed for posture and in actual fact dated from the middle of the Spanish Inquisition. He set his pen down. What made you say, yes, then if he's so irresponsible? Lisa remained silent as she labored on a particularly complex quadratic equation. Finally, realizing Will wasn't about to just let it go, she looked up at him. I don't know, he asked, I guess. She looked about her. Think I could sneak into the teacher's lounge and raid the coffee pot? She said, trying to change the subject. Will chuckled as he picked up his pen. So it's because no one else asked. I understand. He ducked under her hand that flew out to connect solidly with his shoulder. It stung, but he continued to laugh at her. He stopped laughing when Rafiq came out of the audio-visual supply room pushing a TV VCR unit on its tall cart. Both Lisa and Will picked up their textbooks at the same time, trying desperately to appear busy. But it was too late. Rafiq stopped the cart and grinned at them. Hey guys. Are you looking forward to the dance on Friday night? He leaned on their table. They're letting Josh DJ it this year, and I am rigging the lights. It's going to be fun. He stopped and smiled at Lisa. Are you going with anyone? Will hid his choking laughter by coughing into his hand. Lisa's face was truly a sight to behold, and if he had a camera, it would have made a great Kodak moment. There was something about white on Lisa, it set off her deep auburn hair. I'm going with Brody, I'm sorry, Rafiq. She apologized, and it almost sounded sincere. At least there was something. Lisa always seemed to let guys down gently. Rafiq nodded his head, adjusting his glasses sullenly as he made an excuse and wheeled the cart out of the library destined for whatever class had requested it. When the doors had closed, Will looked up from his paper. That was almost cruel. Lisa shrugged. What? I told him the truth, didn't I? He's a sweet guy, but, hello, desperate. Will looked towards the doors and shook his head. No doubt that was the reason Rafiq couldn't get a date. You just couldn't go around with a big neon sign over your head that screamed desperate. And despite the fact that Rafiq's dad ran the paper mill that employed half the town, he just couldn't compensate for his total lack of social graces. He affixed a prospective date in a set of floodlights, concentrating so much emotion upon them that they couldn't help but say no to him. It was a shame. Rafiq really wasn't that bad of a guy. "Who are you taking?" Lisa asked, interrupting his thoughts. It brought Will back from his deep contemplation and grounded him in the present. He hadn't actually been planning on going to the semi-formal. His jaw worked a few times as he struggled to offer her an answer and in the end shook his head, hadn't thought about it. "I don't go to dances." She shrugged. "But there must be someone, right? I mean, there has to be someone you want to take. What about Jennifer?" Will shook his head. "Jenny and I are just friends. She's going through a rough patch right now with the pregnancy." "Oh." Lisa grimaced. "How's she doing? Has she heard anything from Jacob? He is the dad, right?" Will sighed as he continued to work on fleshing out his paper. "Jacob took off as soon as he heard she was pregnant, typical deadbeat dad. She's over it though. I saw her this morning in the cafeteria, and she was devouring a banana raisin muffin." He shook his head. "But as for taking her to the dance, I'm not interested in her that way, we're just good friends." Lisa studied him for a moment, trying to read his face to see if he was trying to trick her, and finally she gave up. "Well, she likes you, she won't stop talking about you." Will rolled his eyes. "I'm just a shoulder she cries on, it's not as if we're ever going any further with it, I'm not attracted to her." He thumbed at the doors Rafiq had recently gone through. "It's like you and him, I can't explain it, but I'm not interested." Lisa held up her hands. "Hey, it's okay. Oh, and you spelt necessary wrong." She indicated with her pen to the word that was now flowing from the end of his biro pen. He stopped and mumbled a curse, liberally applying whiteout to the loose-leaf page. He checked the word again and continued with his writing, though the paper was secondary in his mind, as he tried to work out why he wasn't attracted to Jennifer. She was a beautiful girl, pretty in a rural kind of fashion. Not to mention the fact that some benevolent god had gifted her. But he just didn't look at her in that fashion. It was like looking at a sister, you could see everything and instantly know it was wrong to consider her in that way. Jennifer had been his friend ever since he had been dragged to that godforsaken edge of nowhere by his father, who was determined to start a new life for him and his boys. They had shared common interests, and that was great, but that still wasn't enough for him to be attracted to her. Then there was the whole Jacob baby thing. He didn't understand how anyone could let themselves get pregnant. He had never been that in love, he guessed, never been in a relationship long enough to be swept up in the rush of emotions that led to mistakes. He just couldn't picture anyone worth his risking his entire future for. The baby trap was a danger every guy faced in that small town. Most of the intelligent guys who had steady girlfriends and a bright future ahead of them suddenly found that future snatched away from them by unscrupulous girlfriends who saw their boyfriends preparing to head off to university and leave them behind. Nothing killed the dream of a bright future like a bouncing bundle of joy dropping into the lap like a bombshell. That had been Jennifer's goal. She had confessed it to Will one night when they had been sitting up watching cheesy movies. Jacob was getting ready to go on to college to become a carpenter's apprentice. And rather than lose him, she had tried to catch him like so many others. Only Jacob wasn't like the other guys. The last anyone saw of him was him gassing up his car at the edge of town. He had run far and fast. Will swore that wasn't going to happen to him. He was a rare commodity, a young, intelligent man destined for university. He was attractive, if rather average. He wasn't an all-star athlete like Captain Andrew Highmore over in the corner, but he was still a prime target. And Daddy wasn't something he wanted to add to his resume anytime soon. He just kept his mouth shut as he worked on his paper. His education was his ticket out of that small town, a pothole on the road of life as he thought of it. He was destined for other things, go to university, get a good job. He would have a great house in the city and never have to worry about things again. His golden path was set, and he wasn't about to be derailed by a girl. He set his pen down. Done. Lisa looked up from her own homework. "You know I hate you, right?" She nodded to the paper. "You're the English department's golden boy. He that can do no wrong." She rolled her eyes as he flashed her a smug smile. "And what makes it worse is that you know it too." "Yep," Will replied as he allowed his eyes to wander about the library. over the battered books and metal shelves that were typical of high school libraries everywhere. The librarian was still working to put the day's book returns back on the shelves. The announcement board that no one bothered to read announced the Christmas semi-formal on Friday. And Andrew Highmore was watching him. He stopped and glanced back, but the captain had gone back to his textbook, and Will shrugged it off. He was a sophomore, and beneath the notice of a senior. Shame really. Andrew was supposedly a good person to talk to, and if his reputation was to be believed, really good at getting the girls. He was one of those people everyone tried to emulate in one fashion or another. Even Will had to admit that he respected Andrew. Will yawned as he closed his books and glanced at his watch. The bell would go in a few minutes and then English class. Mr. Greenwood would give them their review for the Christmas finals. A good chance to re-examine the texts covered over the year, and Will was secretly looking forward to challenging himself on the exam. He could prove that he had earned his grades for all the effortless papers he had written over the course of the year. Jared just walked in. Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper as she stared appreciatively at the Storm goalie as he walked over to Andrew. He was also in their year, and a good athlete, even if he wasn't the best of students. He had earned his place on the school team that year. Will liked Jared, they spoke occasionally, and mostly Will helped Jared with his English assignments when they got a chance. Another throwback to their freshman year when he and Jared had been paired up for a number of biology labs. It wasn't that they were friends, but rather they knew each other and worked well together. Jared had a way with the practical lab assignments that allowed Will to work on the notes. Will glanced up and watched as Jared and Andrew talked by the windows, and Will noticed it had started to snow again. He shuddered, glad he had brought his heavy winter coat with him. The Canadian winter was cold enough to cut to the bone, and that year it was especially severe. Rumor was that it was supposed to drop to -50 later in the week. Toque-wearing weather. He always looked stupid in a toque. He owned one, but refused to wear it unless the weather was exceptionally cold because he looked silly in the gaudy blue and white knitted hat with its bauble on top. But he had to admit it looked better than the silly fleece jester hat Lisa wore in the cold. He grinned at her, snowing again. She groaned, catching sight of it herself. Great, I'm taking the bus home tonight. She folded her arms in disgust. No way I am walking in that. Will yawned again as he picked up his books and stood up. It will be okay, only one more period to go, we should be home before the worst of it hits. Lisa picked up her own books, her eyes still locked on the drifting white snow building up outside. Well, maybe tomorrow will be a snow day. Will grinned at the pleasant thought. I think it might. It was the end of the day, and as usual Will was running late for his bus. He sprinted through the halls of the school trying to get to his locker. He had been held up trying to finish a review problem with his physics teacher. Miss Smith seemed in no hurry to explain it, expecting him to wait patiently while she droned on about how object A when pushed affected object B and gave C result. He had enough trouble trying to grasp the concept, but when he had so little time until the bus left and he was stranded at school, he really hadn't given it his full attention. He flew down a flight of stairs trying to get to the basement level of the school where, due to overcrowding, several banks of extra lockers had been set up. It was tucked away from the rest of the school beside the boiler room and the chemistry labs. Due to its proximity away from the rest of the school, it was a favorite hangout for those kids looking to grab a smoke in the emergency exit well that led up to the student parking lot. A little bit of shelter from the wind. Will didn't mind having his locker down there. It was out of the way and he could always chat to Brody, who was often hanging about the exit with some of his buddies. But Brody was off that day, and everyone else had gone home as soon as school let out, so he was alone. The ruined door to his locker soon soured his mood. He stood and stared at the mess of his books turned out onto the floor, and his notes scattered about, torn and disorganized. His heart sank as he dropped to pick them up, pushing them back into his locker in an effort to preserve them. He couldn't help but sigh dejectedly as he picked up the two halves of his English book, a faithful friend that had died valiantly. He tossed it into the locker after his notes and stood up. He didn't have time to report it that night, and he would have to wait until the morning. He stopped when he saw his coat was missing. He swore loudly. Who the hell stole a coat from someone in a snowstorm? It was so supremely cruel that it just fit some of the guys who went to Will's high school. Will reluctantly closed the door of his locker as best he could on only one hinge, bending the twisted metal back into shape. He was screwed and he knew it. He jogged back up to the main office of the school, but found it locked up, only a janitor left sweeping the floor. He caught sight of Will and shook his head. They all went home, the storm. You'd better go home as well. There is a big snowstorm coming and it is already pretty messy out there. Will nodded as he hurried through the halls to where the buses always waited day after day, hoping he wasn't too late. He burst out of the doors just as the last bus pulled out of the parking lot and headed out into the street. And Will felt hope evaporate as he stood there watching large flakes of snow falling down around him. It didn't truly hit him how bad his situation was until he turned back to the doors to find they had locked behind him. He was trapped outside the school in the storm. He realized only then that the storm was much stronger than he had first thought. What he had seen when he had burst out of the school was only the view from the lee side of the building. He didn't realize the full danger ahead of him. He pulled his plaid shirt closer about him to ward off the cold as he struggled down the hill the school was built upon. He was glad for once that he tried to keep up with the latest fashion and had worn a t-shirt under it, otherwise had he just been in his t-shirt. He slipped a little on the icy sidewalk that had yet to be cleared, and managed to steady himself. His Aunt Magella lived about 10 minutes from his school. If he could make it there he would be able to call his dad for a lift home. He dreaded the prospect. His father hated it when he missed a bus. He could just hear the lecture now about responsibility and how he should take better care of his property. As if he wanted to be struggling through a snowstorm in just a thin shirt with no gloves. He buried his hands into his armpits. Trying to stay warm was critical. It wasn't far, he just had to keep telling himself that. It didn't matter that the snow came down harder, that his cap brim was now forming a ledge of snow. As if on cue, the wind snatched it from his head and sent it sailing into an embankment. He stared after it mournfully. Short of his climbing through a 4-foot-high snow bank which he simply wasn't dressed for, there was no way to get it back. He swore again, it just wasn't his day. He struggled onwards, determined to get out of the cold. He didn't even notice as the black Mustang slid to a halt beside him. "Are you nuts?" the driver called as he rolled down his window. Will glanced over at the captain of the hockey team and shivered. "I missed the bus," he explained, continuing to walk. If he stopped it meant he would be out in the cold longer. Andrew let the car coast along beside the snow-covered sophomore. "What happened to your coat?" he asked as he turned down the radio. Will shrugged. "Someone trashed my locker." He slipped again on a patch of ice and again managed to stay upright. Andrew shook his head. "I can give you a lift, beats walking in this without a coat." Will looked over at the classic Mustang. Andrew's car was the envy of all the students at the school. It was a beautifully restored 1969 coupe that seemed to epitomize Andrew. He embodied the kind of person that the car had been designed for, young and full of energy. He nodded as he crossed to the coupe and slid into the passenger seat, immediately glad of the car's heater, even though he was still soaked to the skin from the melting snow. Andrew looked over at him and undid his seatbelt. Shrugging out of his varsity jacket he handed it over to Will. "Here, put this on, you're soaked." Will accepted the treasured jacket. It was as much a part of Andrew's identity as the car was. He held it for a moment, feeling the soft leather in his hands, before he put it on. It was already warm from Andrew's body heat, and the combination of Andrew's sweat, cologne and worn leather assailed his nose. He relaxed wrapped in the warm coat and sank into the seat, glad just to be warm. "So where am I taking you?" Andrew asked as he drove the car down the hill and onto the street. "My aunt's should be good, I can call my dad and get a lift home." Andrew rolled his shoulders in a shrug. "Might as well take you straight home, rather than let this storm get worse." He gunned the engine and was satisfied that the tires had a firm grip on the snow-covered road surface. The plows hadn't been passed yet so driving was treacherous and he kept it slow. "You don't have to do that," Will assured. "I mean you've already done so much." "It's no problem at all," Andrew said in reply, flashing a charming smile. "I was going to head to practice after school but with the storm it's probably best if I went home anyway." "So where do you live?" "Just outside of town, you know the access road?" Will replied as he returned the smile. "It's the other side of Merrickville." Andrew grinned. "Not that far from me then, cool." As they drove to the road, Will found the snow was blowing so heavily that he could not see anything through the windshield. He could catch a glimpse of the road between snow gusts, and he knew there was no traffic on the road in that area, especially during the storm. But Andrew seemed determined to go ahead and Will felt a bit reassured when he took a look at the gasoline gauge. The car had almost a full tank. On the westbound road Andrew drove the car onwards, pushing through the northern wind, into the darkness, where they could see nothing besides horizontally flying snow. The only thing Andrew could do to keep the car on the road was to look out the driver's side window to keep an eye on the left edge of the road, taking advantage of his car to shield his view. They could not drive more than 5 miles per hour. For the entire 5 miles before the first stop sign, the car stayed in first gear. Will had survived a few snowstorms, one growing up in England, and one the year before when he had first arrived in Canada, traveling through vast curtains of falling snow as his family had driven across the country from Halifax to Ottawa along the Trans-Canada Highway. But this time it was so different. Hundreds of tons of snow was flying in a fierce wind, so that he could not tell where the sky ended and the earth began, and there was almost no chance for them to take a breath or find any reference in the gusty wind. What is more, darkness was setting in. Will started to become nervous, since Andrew could barely see 5 feet away, and he could slide the car off the road at any moment. Will thought of urging him to go back into town, but it would be very difficult to make a 3-point turn without running a wheel off the road. It was easier to keep going forward, in the meantime getting farther into the wildness. Even so, Andrew had to come to a complete stop 4 times, the blowing snow was so dense. If it were not for the flying snow, they could have caught glimpses of the fields they were passing. The endless fields, lined up in rows and columns that stretched over 20 miles. Their emptiness in the night often gave Will the feeling of an evil presence, and he was relieved that he couldn't see them at all. It was as if the storm had enveloped the whole world. As the car drifted through the snow, Will felt as if he were on a boat in a rough sea, or a leaf floating in the sky. They came to a stop sign and made a right-hand turn to the north. 2 miles further there was an S-curve where the road had a yield sign for CN trains bound for Toronto. Since they were traveling north against the gusty wind, Andrew lost the advantage of having his car be a vision shield to let him see whether he was still on the road. The wind was blowing towards them. The snow would have been flying into their eyes if there had not been a windshield. The northbound road was worse, since the snow was thicker. Fortunately there was no oncoming traffic, otherwise they would have instantly collided with each other. The car finally managed to reach the S-curve. And Will became more nervous as they approached the curve, because it was there that he had run into the ditch on his first driving lesson, turning himself completely about on a still, sunny morning. It was the same place that his father had once run into a deer shortly after dusk. It was just a bad curve. Will prayed not to run into a deer and not to skid on ice. And Andrew finally managed to get through the curve while keeping the car on the road. It still took them about half an hour to cover the half-mile distance. By going north for another mile they would come to the second stop sign at a T-junction, where they would turn left and go west. Although Andrew was only driving in first gear, he almost overshot the road into the ditch. Will barely saw the stop sign on his right as the Mustang traveled another 15 feet on the slippery road before coming to a full stop. Andrew blew out a sigh of relief as the car made the turn. Luckily there were no cars coming from either direction. Now Andrew could again take advantage of his car as a vision shield, so he could find the edge of the road through his left-hand window and stay on the road. Even so, several times they went very close to the left edge and almost drove off the road. The gusting was stronger. It was as if the whole world was being wiped away. Will knew they would pass by a farmhouse on their right which was almost halfway home. Still, he completely missed the farmhouse, although the house had its driveway lights on and was only 20 feet from the road. He didn't realize this until he saw a dim light on his left-hand side. They were passing a substation, and it was the gate's lithium light he saw which normally hurt his eyes from miles away. He felt a kind of warmth, because he was finally seeing something familiar. There were some wild trees on the roadside after the gate. He could barely see their silhouettes in the blowing snow. And he knew they would come to 2 more turns, and soon they would be on local Highway 6. He realized the reason he could see the outlines of the trees was that they cut the wind a little bit. He should have also realized that the nearby trees could also cause snowdrifts on the road, which could block any kind of traffic. Very soon they realized they were running into trouble. Snowdrifts extended across the whole area and piled up high, so that neither of them could see where the road was. This realization was so sudden that neither of them had time to think, but could only keep driving onward. Will knew that if they stopped, the car would also turn into a snowdrift, with them buried in the blowing snow. There was no squeal of brakes, no blaring horn, only the sudden smashing impact and the impossibly loud cries of screeching metal. The car lurched to the left, the back end swinging around on the wet, slushy pavement. The impact threw Will against his seatbelt so hard it cut off his breath. The car spun like a child's top, whipping almost a full 360 degrees as the back end flew into the ditch. Will's head snapped back when the car crunched to a halt. As suddenly as it started, it ended, leaving complete silence except for the rapid clicking of a ruined motor cooling in the night's grip. At the moment they hit, Will sensed they were going to die. He sensed they were in desperate trouble. He sensed that what he had heard of happening to other people was happening to them. He sensed that he might be dead and that his family were going to miss him. He sensed. So many thoughts went through his head at once, just like a brilliant lightning flashing in the dark, illuminating the whole landscape, before everything returned to total darkness. Trembling, he glanced over at Andrew, who sat with his hands clenched on the steering wheel, breathing hard as he stared out of the cracked windscreen. He turned his head and caught Will's eyes. "Whoa!" was all he could manage. Will shook his head to clear the shock as he looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 5:40 p.m. He realized that it had taken them 2 hours to cover 10 miles. There were still 10 more miles to any kind of town. Andrew restarted the engine, which sputtered to life, but it sounded ragged, like it would die at any moment. A quick check of the gasoline gauge showed that the tank was 90% full. He looked over at the shattered passenger side window. As the engine idled, Andrew quickly patted himself down as he checked his clothes, before he stopped and looked over at Will's, but he didn't have to check. Will was still soaked, huddled in the leather varsity jacket, and he shook his head. "I just cleaned my car out this morning. I didn't think to put anything back into it. Though I might have a small blanket under your seat." He looked over at Will for a moment, weighing the options. Eventually he just scrubbed his face. "What are we going to do?" Will sat quietly trying to think as Andrew tried to rock the car back and forth to see if he would have any luck getting it out. He failed. He knew the more he tried that, the more trouble they might get into. Many ideas and options spun through his mind, but none of them seemed possible. In frustration, Andrew shut the engine off to preserve gas. "We could use the horn," Will offered, shivering as he looked out of his shattered window at the snow that blew past him, feeling the heat rushing out of the car. "Someone might hear us and come to the rescue." He recalled that in many stories, people used various ways to send out SOS signals. Try tapping out a Morse code, long and short signals. It was a lame suggestion, he knew, but all he could think of. "SOS?" Andrew asked as he tried long short long, short long short, with both horn and headlights. But it was to no effect. Finally he stopped and couldn't help laughing at himself. Will chuckled as well. In such a stormy night with the wind roaring, miles from anywhere, who would hear the horn? Who would see their lights? It was the same as his not being able to hear anything but the blasting wind. He could not see anything but blowing snow. Even if anyone could see or hear them, it would have been all but impossible for them to get through in such a bad weather. Will suddenly felt very insignificant as he reached under the seat to pull out Andrew's blanket, one of the small thermal kind that was really just a square of fleece cloth. He held it as he shivered again, looking over at the man who had come to his rescue only to fall victim to the storm as well. He felt guilty suddenly, as if it was his fault they were stranded. Andrew, as if reading his mind, shook his head and offered him a half-smile. "We'll be okay," he said reassuringly as he looked out of the window at the driving snow. "There'll be a plow along soon, or a car, or something, and we'll just flag them down and get them to help us." To break the dull sound of blowing snow through the broken window, he turned on the radio. Lively music instantly filled the car and he brightened. "Look, at least we still get the bear." Will smiled in return. At least they weren't totally isolated from civilization. Environment Canada has issued a severe winter storm warning for Ottawa, Hull, Montreal, and regions of eastern Ontario and Quebec. 45 to 60 centimeters of snow are expected to fall in the region by morning. Temperatures are expected to remain around the freezing for the next few hours, then fall rapidly to -20. Sustained winds north by northwest of 30 km per hour gusting to 55 km per hour. There is an extreme wind chill warning in effect, with the wind chill factor approaching -45 degrees later this evening. Sub-zero temperatures. 40 below. Will shuddered at the thought, shivering again as he stared out at the snow again. He always hated the cold, and it would be a cruel fate for him to die that way. Residents are being advised not to leave their homes except in cases of extreme emergency. The following road closures are in effect. The rest of the broadcast was a series of road and school closing announcements for the next day. At least Lisa's hopes of a snow day were confirmed. With the trembling voice of the broadcaster, Will started to feel a trembling too. He recalled the last time when there had been severe weather. The advisory was, "Don't go out unless necessary." Apparently this time it was a very bad and rare weather situation. Andrew saw him tremble and a look of concern crossed his face. He smiled and said, "Well, they don't have to come out, but we have to stay here." It was a feeble attempt at humor, but it still made his passenger smile. "I'm sorry, Andrew," Will began, realizing his teeth were beginning to chatter. "Should have just gone to my aunt's." Andrew shrugged, "And then I would be here alone. I take this road home every day, so I'd be stuck here anyway." He stopped, noticing Will's lack of attention and shivering. And he tried to restart the car. His look of concern became one of worry as he heard an unusual sound from the engine, like someone had used a blanket to choke the engine. A low and continuous engine blowing sound persisted. "I just got this car fixed," he exclaimed. He rubbed the window and stared out at the snow drifting up beside the car and realized that the snow had covered the exhaust pipe so the engine could not breathe. Will glanced up and noticed that the snowdrift had already piled up so high on the left-hand side that the side window was covered. Half of the car was completely under snow. Andrew looked over at Will, who was watching him silently in concern, trying to wrap himself into the blanket to stay warm as the heat was quickly pulled from the body of the car, no longer able to heat itself. He reached into the glove box of the car and fished out a small book and began to flip through it. Will continued to watch him as he did so, trying desperately to say something, but his words kept coming out as incoherent phrases between the stammering and the chattering of his teeth. In the end he just gestured at the book. Andrew glanced up and offered a tight smile. "Hypothermia." He began to read as he showed Will the cover of the small Scout survival booklet. "The treatment for hypothermia requires that the body core temperature be raised to a normal level, aided by outside sources of heat. Some recommended suggestions include stripping the victim, who is then placed into a sleeping bag along with one or two likewise attired companions. In such a situation there's no room for modesty." Will blinked. Was Andrew serious? "Get him off now," Andrew directed, already reaching out to begin to unbutton Will's shirt. Will could do nothing but sit there, leaning forward when told to do so that Andrew could take his shirt off. He shivered a moment, pulling the blanket around him as Andrew worked his trousers off. He tried to focus, but all he wanted to do was fall asleep. He yawned loudly. "Don't even think about it, Will," Andrew threatened as he peeled off his own shirt. "Stay with me and don't fall asleep." He yawned again, and he had vague recollections of consciousness, of feeling warmth wrapped about him, of the strong smell of perspiration and cologne, of someone talking. He opened his eyes again and blinked at the pair of blue eyes staring into his own. He focused and glanced about him. "What? You're back then?" Andrew said, his voice husky with emotion. "I was worried." Will shifted and realized Andrew was holding him gently, keeping him warm with his own body heat. He immediately reddened at the intimacy of the moment. What time is it?" he stammered. "Close to 9:30. Andrew replied, his breath frosting in the cold air of the rest of the car. He had somehow wrestled Will into the back seat where they were now huddled for survival. They had been stranded out in the cold for hours. Someone had to be missing them, to report that they were still out in the storm. If not Will's parents, then Andrew's mother. The snow was still blowing constantly, and Will suddenly felt privileged to be watching the blizzard from so close. Will appreciated the fact that he was still comfortable. His cheek brushed Andrew's, feeling the sandpapery texture of a 5 o'clock shadow and the soft smell of his skin. He swallowed as he stared up at the snow. The snow was flying horizontally past his eyes. The whole world was flying horizontally. He felt sleepy and tired laying there. So he lay there staring upwards. He saw that Andrew had been inventive. The broken window had been patched with the floor mats. Only then did he realize that the ceiling of the car was much smaller in size than he had thought, in relation to the car, since he was able to see out the windows on all four sides, and the square ceiling was only a small barrier between them and the sky. He felt insignificant in the mighty storm. Like he was just a tiny powerless creature trying to survive in the anger of Mother Nature. He started to laugh at himself for the naive attempt earlier to send out signals for help. It was no use at all. Even a village, a town, or a city, could be wiped out, or simply engulfed, if the storm got really ferocious. In front of the mighty storm, all political struggles in human society seemed meaningless, not to mention personal fights. What were they for? Everything could just be erased. In the face of such a true power, human conflict was so childish. Mankind had so many dangerous enemies already in the world around him that he didn't need to fight his own kind as well. Through the side window, the twinkle of a star reached his eyes in between the snow gusts. Hey! I am able to see the sky. He managed, and he felt Andrew shift to see for himself. It was a small sliver of hope that the storm might diminish in strength. I told you we would be okay, Andrew said with a smile. We're warm at least. He suddenly chuckled as if he found something funny. What? Will asked, feeling self-conscious all of a sudden. Andrew bit his lip as he looked down at the pair of them curled up in just their underwear beneath a pitifully small blanket. It's just. I didn't expect the first time I would be doing this in the back seat of a car would be with a guy. Will chuckled, ditto. He stopped and looked into Andrew's eyes. You mean you've never? I mean it's okay, it's just that you have a reputation. Andrew hesitated as if considering what to say, or how much he trusted this virtual stranger who he was now entwined with. He nodded after a moment. Nope, never have. No reason really, I just didn't. He grinned, though Charlene keeps trying to corner me. Will laughed. Charlene was a cheerleader with an appetite for men that had earned her a reputation for being easy. Yeah, she got Jared from what I hear. What about you? Andrew asked, turning the conversation back on Will. Aren't you and that Jenny girl? Will shook his head. No, she's. I just. He trailed off. Andrew squeezed Will's arm in understanding. No, I get it. I think that's why I've been single. I am going to university next year, getting the hell away from here. Will leaned on Andrew's other arm. Oh? Where are you going? I got a scholarship to go to UNB, I want to go on to law school. Andrew seemed mildly embarrassed by it. That's great, Will said. I've got my sights set on Dalhousie University in Halifax. Good school, Andrew replied. He moved his arm so that it now rested along Will's side. Any ideas what you want to do? Will shook his head. None. I just know I want to get as far away from here as I can. Andrew studied him a moment. You really hate it here? Will shrugged as he tried to express how he felt in words. I don't fit here. And my dad can't wait to just get on with his new life. New life? Will let out a heavy breath again, not exactly sure why he was opening up to someone he barely knew, telling him the personal things about himself, but as it stood there was a strong chance they wouldn't survive the night stranded without heat in the car. He looked at the eyes, really the only thing he could see in the gloom of the back seat, and decided to just keep talking. My dad remarried, it was the reason we moved here. He wanted to start a new family. He sighed. I just don't fit into that very well. I remind him of everything he tried to leave behind when he came here. He takes it out on you? Andrew asked, his fingers brushing Will's shoulder lightly, absently. Will nodded. He resents me for it, but I only have a year to go, then I can leave and he gets what he wants, his new life. What about your mom? Andrew asked. Will looked down for a moment and sighed. No idea, she took off and left a long time ago. So it's just me. My dad died last year, Andrew confessed, just my mom and I now, and she's pretty cut up about me leaving Merrickville to go to UNB in Fredericton. But I just have to go somewhere else for a bit. I am thinking of doing law school here though. He stared up at the snow-covered rear window. I like it here. It's your home. Will finished for him. I just haven't found mine yet. It's just a matter of finding yourself first. Andrew returned. My dad always said that to me. I don't know who I am yet. You're the Andrew Highmore. Will said with a wry grin. You're athlete of the year, set to be valedictorian as well. Half the school worships you. He felt Andrew chuckle and adjust himself to press warmly against Will's stomach. True, but you're the William Carter. Everyone knows you're a whiz at writing papers. Really? Will asked. Doesn't that make me a geek or something? Andrew laughed again. Nah, too many people jealous of it. I watched you working in the library this afternoon with that Lisa girl who dates that shop jock. Brody? Will supplied. Yeah, Brody. Anyway, I watched you write a paper in, like, half an hour. How'd you do it so fast? He shook his head in wonder. You're going to do well at university where papers and stuff are more important than exams. Will nodded. Yeah, try telling my dad that. He keeps yelling at me over my math scores. He's just an asshole. Andrew said and froze. I didn't mean, I'm sorry I. Will laughed at Andrew's sudden awkwardness. No, it's okay, the major is an asshole, I know that. As I said, one more year. Why do you do that? Andrew asked suddenly. What? Will asked. Call your dad, the major? Will nodded. He is one, British Army, he's stationed here as a liaison officer. Growing up everyone just called him the major, I guess I did too. You don't call him Dad? Andrew seemed fascinated by something Will just took for granted. Will nodded. I do, but it doesn't seem to fit him, I always just thought of him as the major. You're strange. Andrew said with a smile. Chapter 2. They must have talked all night, simply lying there in the car listening to the sound of the wind blowing the snow outside their makeshift shelter. They had just talked about anything and everything that came to their minds. They just opened up, why hold back? It was as if they needed to learn about the person lying beside them. As if by their physical contact they also had to form a mental and emotional one to survive. Will had talked about his home in England, of his family and eventual dreams to go home. Hopes and dreams were something he seldom confessed, but he found he could just say them. Andrew wasn't going to judge him for them, or hold them against him. In fact, Andrew followed by sharing his own dreams. I want a nice townhouse, he confessed as he brushed away a piece of lint that had fallen onto Will's cheek. I don't want to live out in the country anymore, I want to be downtown, where the life is. He sighed. I know it's not as exotic as living in another country. England isn't exactly exotic, Will said a little flushed. It's dirty and grimy in places, and there are so many people. But when you are up on the downs early in the morning, it's beautiful. Andrew nodded as he rolled over to look at the dashboard clock. Hey, it's 6 a.m. Will sat upright, adjusting the blanket so he wouldn't be cold. What do we do now? Andrew reluctantly sat up beside Will, claiming back half the covers and pressing up against his companion for warmth. I guess we should see if it's still snowing outside. If it isn't, we should try to get help. Will reached into the front of the car and picked up his clothes, still damp, but nothing that wouldn't dry with a little body heat. He sat back down with them in his lap. I didn't say thank you for last night. Andrew looked at him for a moment, just watching him, and then he spoke. It's no problem, thanks for waking up. He threw an arm up and around Will one last time and drew him close. Will relaxed in the embrace. After a night of being intimate by circumstance, he too was reluctant to let go. It had been an emotional night, and there was something about sharing a struggle for survival with another human being that made you close to them. He just sat there, breathing in that now all too familiar scent of cologne and skin. All right then, he said as he gave Will a friendly pat on the shoulder and released the hug. Time to get dressed. He reached into the front for his own clothes and began to pull them on. If we're lucky, we should be able to reach one of those farmhouses we passed earlier last night. Will nodded as he did up his shirt. Going to be a bit of a hike. Andrew smiled as he tossed Will his jacket. Here, wear that again, I'm going to. He produced a small pocket knife and began to cut a hole in the blanket. Moments later he donned it like a poncho. Not exactly Don Quixote, but it should keep me warm. Will couldn't help but smile. Clint Eastwood had rescued him. Andrew stared down at himself and grinned lopsidedly. Well, that's it, it's official. I look stupid. Will tugged on his shoes and tried his hardest not to laugh. How do we get out if the car is snowed under? He asked. Andrew slipped into the front seat and tried the passenger side door. After putting his full weight into it, he managed to get it to open. A few more tries and he was able to step out into the cold November morning. Will slipped out behind him and stared around at the white landscape. Snow clung to everything, smothering the world beneath it, and it took Will a moment to figure out exactly what had happened the night before. The car had somehow managed to leap an embankment and leave the road only to end up in a field. As Andrew struggled down the embankment, he pointed to the snowdrift they had hit. We must have hit that like a ski jump. He struggled down onto the road, and examined the freshly plowed and salted road. Will struggled down behind, jumping over a snow bank and sliding to a halt beside Andrew. How come we didn't hear the plow go by? He asked, looking about him, pulling Andrew's jacket closer about his lean frame. Andrew narrowed his eyes as he stared up the road. The snow must have muffled it, or we were too far away from the road. He glanced behind him at the trail of devastation that led to a mound of snow with an all-too-familiar Mustang logo sticking out of it on a battered fender. Will swallowed. How had they survived? From where he stood it looked hopeless. He felt himself begin to shiver again. We can't stay here, Andrew said as he turned and placed a hand on Will's shoulder. There has to be a house or something close by. They trudged along the road for a good half hour before they were spotted. A passing elderly couple in a station wagon stopped as Andrew flagged them down. A quick explanation saw the pair loaded into the back and driven to the nearest RCMP station. And while the police officer on duty phoned their parents, the assistant fed them cup after cup of warm coffee as she checked them both over for injuries. Andrew's mother Micheline arrived first. The short spitfire of a woman burst through the doors of the station, firing question after question at the policeman in rapid succession. It was hard to tell if she was speaking French or English, but only after she caught sight of Andrew and had a hold of him was she capable of holding a conversation. Andrew explained to her about the accident, and Will noticed he chose not to mention the details of their night huddled in the car. Some things didn't need to be said, and Will was in total agreement about that. He watched her tearful examination of her son for any injuries, and of her obvious relief at finding none. Will's father's arrival was a lot more sedate. He marched through the doors with a bearing that only his years in the army had bred in him. A cold assessment told him everything he needed to know about the situation, and he addressed the officer on duty as if he were addressing a man under his command. Every question was precise, clipped. The major asking his troops for a report. When he had concluded his debriefing, he finally moved across to look down at his son. "Are you all right?" he asked, studying his son's disheveled appearance and borrowed jacket. Even at that moment there was no familiarity permitted, there was no warmth. Will nodded silently. You simply didn't admit weakness to the major. To do so would garner a look of disappointment that Will had grown up to fear. He simply stood up and set his mug of coffee aside. "I'm fine, sir." The major only nodded, considering him a moment before he looked over at Andrew and his mother. He didn't say a word as he turned and marched back to the police officer to find out if Will was permitted to leave. Micheline followed him with her eyes, before she looked at Will again. She patted Andrew on the cheek and then joined Will's father at the counter. Will began to take off Andrew's coat to hand it back to him, but Andrew shook his head. "Give it back to me at school." He reached out one final time to touch Will's shoulder. "I'm glad you're okay." Will nodded, "Thank you." Andrew just smiled. "Tomorrow, Carter." Will half smiled. The drive home passed in near silence, the Bronco bouncing along the freshly plowed roads as his father drove confidently towards the farmhouse. Will sat still, huddled in Andrew's jacket, still aware of the smell of cologne and sweat that hung to it. Memories of his experience still fresh in his mind as he struggled to find a meaning to it. When the Bronco turned into the drive, his father pulled to a stop and looked at his son. "Why were you in a car last night, and where is your jacket?" Will glanced up at his father and shrugged. "I missed my bus. Andrew offered to give me a lift home. We hit a snowdrift and lost control. The reason I was late was because someone stole my jacket." "You were being picked on." The major rolled the words out with a vehemence that spoke of his disgust. Will shook his head. They had no way of knowing whose locker they broke into. I tried to report it, but everyone had already left. So I decided to walk to Aunt Magella's. The Major considered this for a moment. You were walking in a storm without a coat on? Will shrugged. I figured it was only a short walk to Magella's and from there I would be fine. His father flipped open the door and got out of the truck, slamming it closed as Will got out the other side. He studied his son again. You're lucky that other boy came along when he did. Will nodded as his father continued. It's probably a good thing you have a friend like him. You could learn something about responsibility. He stepped into the kitchen and pulled off his boots, already crossing to the coffee pot. Will followed him inside, shrugging off the jacket. You're right, I probably could. He's the captain of the hockey team. The Major snorted as he poured himself a cup of the strong coffee he always seemed to have on hand. Hockey. He returned to the kitchen table and sat down. I suppose it's better than nothing. Go get showered and changed and report back here. Your mother will make breakfast soon. Will inclined his head and slipped away. He was thankful to be away for a short period of time. His father was in a strange mood, and Will was glad to finally have a chance to get cleaned up. Refreshed and changed, he returned to the kitchen and the chaos that reigned there. Jackie was already rattling pots, smoking heavily as she angrily slammed a heavy pot onto the range. He could sense her hostility as he sat down at the table. She was obviously angered at being awoken so early in the day. He decided it best to simply stay out of her way that morning. Lucy burbled at him, happily looking up from her high chair as she played with her spoon. He smiled down at her and, when no one was looking, gave her a wink. She burbled again and beamed at him, reaching out to take his finger. Willie. She burbled again. Leave her alone. Jackie commented as she threw some oats into the pot of boiling water. It was oatmeal again, the true breakfast of champions. He felt his stomach constrict inside, but he said nothing and returned to looking at Lucy. She was beautiful to him, the only thing about that house that had any life left. She was only his half-sister, and the reason he felt as though he didn't belong there. But that wasn't her fault. She was completely innocent and totally deserving of his attention. In fact, he felt closer to her than with his father or his wife Jackie. And in a way she was closer to him than she was to either of them. Willie had been her first word. Much to Jackie's annoyance, something he hadn't deliberately taught her either, it had just happened. And when it had come time for her to take her first hesitant steps, they had been towards him, away from her mother. It only seemed to reinforce the resentment Jackie felt towards him. She did her best to limit their time together, but there was always Sunday nights, when she went with the Major to the Legion. On those nights Will was left to care for Lucy, and he craved those nights, when he would simply sit on the edge of her bed reading her story after story. In a way he was able to give her some of the attention he had never had. I said leave her alone. Jackie stated forcefully as she set the steaming bowl of porridge oats down in front of him. He hid his shallow smile as he set into the vile concoction, stirring it about as he stared out of the window at the cold day beyond. Will felt a new trepidation as he walked through the front doors of the high school and into the lobby. He was early that morning. His bus usually dropped him off at the school a half hour before it was due to begin, a great chance to socialize with his friends before the rush of the day swept them off. And it was a great chance for him to get his hands on a cup of coffee. Lisa always brought a thermos and a couple of her mother's muffins with her each morning, which she was always ready to share with Will, knowing all too well what breakfast was usually served to Major Carter's troops. He grinned at her as he sat down, dropping his backpack alongside the table and accepting the mug she handed him with a sigh of relief. "Anyone ever tell you you're beautiful first thing in the morning?" he said as he took a pull on the cup, feeling the rush of the warm liquid down his throat. "You're such a flirt, Carter," she accused as she began to unwrap the muffins. "My mom wants your opinion on this batch of muffins," she said matter-of-factly. She was experimenting, and since you eat just about anything. He picked up the muffin and sniffed it carefully. "Banana?" he asked. She nodded, watching him break into it. She didn't mind brining him an extra muffin each morning. Her mother had practically insisted after she had heard the oatmeal story. Her mother was fond of Will in that maternal way, with good reason. He needed someone to shower him with affection. Lisa's mom, June Highbury, was just one of those phenomenal women that seemed to care for just about everyone without a second thought. He had, on several occasions, been subjected to her temper after one of their pranks had backfired, and he loved her in return. She was just a cool mother. "Isn't that a condor's jacket?" she asked as she picked at her own muffin lazily. Will stopped and glanced down at the jacket he had slung over the back of the chair, and he looked up at her. "Yeah, Andrew lent it to me." "Andrew Highmore?" she asked incredulously, her muffin forgotten for the moment. He winced as he nodded, "Yes." She gave him one of her looks that demanded he tell her everything, but before he could, Jared had joined their table. "Hey guys," he said as he flopped into his chair, pushing his Raiders cap out of his eyes and staring at them with a look that said mornings were not his favorite time of the day. "Will, biology lab, did you?" Will rooted in his backpack and produced the notes cleanly prepared. He separated Jared's copy and handed it over to him. "All done. I was out of it yesterday, but it's all done." Jared smiled. "Cool, thanks He turned to Lisa. "Did you hear they're canceling the dance? There's supposed to be a heavy storm that night and they don't want to risk it." She pushed her muffin away from her in disgust. "Well, there go my plans." Jared grinned. "No, 'cause my parents are out of town this weekend." He held up a set of house keys. Lisa's eyes lit up. "I could kiss you." Will held up his hand. "You have a boyfriend, remember?" She scowled. "Yeah, if he ever shows up." She sat back into her chair and looked over at Jared. "What time's the party?" "I have a couple of the boys driving over to Hull to buy some liquor, so any time after 8 people should be showing up." "BYOB." He rested a foot on the edge of the table and gave her a grin. "You can bring Brody if you want." Will sat quietly watching the exchange. He was an afterthought. What did it matter though? It wasn't as if he would actually be able to go to it. He downed his coffee and fished in his bag for his math textbook. He might as well get started on those quadratic problems he had procrastinated over. "Party, Jared?" Andrew's voice caused Will's head to shoot up. Highmore was standing leaning with both hands on Jared's shoulders, looking down at his teammate. "Yeah dude," Jared replied, arcing his head back to look up. "My place on Friday night." "Cool," Andrew said, motioning to the empty chair at the table. "That taken?" he asked, looking at Will. Will shook his head. "Nope." "Good," Andrew said as he sat down and smiled over at Will. "You get home okay yesterday?" Will nodded. "My dad was mad at first, about the coat thing, but he got over it." "That's good," Andrew said nonchalantly as he leaned his chair back on 2 legs and looked around the cafeteria. "Do you still need my jacket?" Will took it off the back of his chair and handed it back across the table. Andrew accepted it and shrugged it on. Lisa and Jared exchanged a look that said they were confused, but Will didn't feel like elaborating. He smiled at Andrew again. "Thank you again." "All part of the service," Andrew said, extending his hands as he grinned. "You're coming to Jared's party Friday, right?" Will balked. He hadn't thought about it. Well. Andrew glanced at Jared. "It's okay if Carter here comes to the festivities, right? My guest?" Jared nodded emphatically. "Sure, he's always invited. He's the reason I am passing biology." "Actually," Will said with a smile, "you do all the work, I just write it up, so technically you're the reason I'm passing." Andrew gave a satisfied nod as he stood up. "Cool, now I have to go find out what's going on at the gym. Catch you all later." He stood up and smiled. "Take care, Carter," he said, hesitating a moment and smiling again before he left. Jared excused himself and left with Andrew, leaving Will in the clutches of one very confused, but very determined Lisa. "What was that?" she asked, her voice raised an octave. "What was what?" Will replied as he looked at her. She pointed the back of the captain of the school team. "What was that?" "Andrew Highmore, I think," Will said with a grin as he poured himself another cup of coffee from the thermos. "Don't get cute with me, Carter." Her voice took on an edge of warning. "First you turn up with his jacket, then he joins us at our table, and then he invites you to a party." She looked at her friend. "And what was that whole 'take care, Carter' thing about?" Will shrugged. "He gave me a ride home on Monday night after some jerk stole my jacket. We got stranded in a snow bank and spent the night trapped in the car. It's no big deal." "Oh my God," she said, her eyes wide in shock. "That's like a movie. Did you eat each other?" He turned his head and stared at her. "What?" "Like that movie Alive, where the plane crashes and they eat each other to stay alive." She smiled. Will shook his head. No, it was just a cold night, we just talked. She nodded. Well, that explains that. Cool, so you're friends with the captain of the team. That's like circle jumping, and since I'm your best friend I get to jump with you. Hello, popularity. I need a new wardrobe. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud shrill otherwise known as the morning bell. And they both stood to head for class. Lunch came entirely too quickly for Will. It seemed as though he had blinked and he was heading down towards his locker. It had been a surreal day for him. Andrew always seemed to be about, either passing him in the halls and nodding, or already in the places he was heading. Purely coincidence. It wasn't as if he was following Will, just that Will hadn't really paid attention to how small the school really was. It only had 400 students spread out across 5 years, and everyone knew everyone else. There were still the usual social divisions that existed in schools everywhere, but here they weren't as important, and often the social lines were blurred. But each time Andrew nodded and said hi to him, people noticed. There were even a couple of cheerleaders that stared at him in a whole new light. If he was worthy of Andrew Highmore's notice, then they had to notice as well. He was glad just to be away from the attention as he slipped into the basement heading for his locker. He drew up short when he saw the door had been hammered back into shape and reinforced with new brackets. He stared at it dumbfounded for a moment. The maintenance staff were never that quick. It's just a locker, dude. Brody said, leaning on the row of lockers beside Will. Lisa told me what happened, so I borrowed some tools from shop. Will grinned at Lisa's boyfriend. Brody was the school's living legend that never seemed to break his stride. The teachers hated him, other students were jealous of him, but he never let that get him down. He was just one of those people that did what made him happy. A free spirit. Will smiled at him. You didn't have to do that. Yeah, I did. Brody said with a nod. I also found something of yours. He held up Will's jacket. Donnie Morgan had it and was bragging to his stoner buddies. I convinced him it didn't look good on him. He shrugged. He was very sorry. Will accepted his coat gratefully. One less worry he had to think about. He put the ski jacket away in his locker and turned back to Brody. Thanks. I owe you. Brody nodded. Yeah, you do. Now I'm going out for a smoke before you get all sappy and shit. Will laughed watching Brody retreat to the emergency exit, another man that watched out for him. He suddenly felt very lucky. Not a bad week so far. He turned to head back upstairs and nearly walked right into Jennifer. Will, she said in surprise, I've been looking all over for you. He allowed himself a smile at her. She was only 4 months pregnant, but she was beginning to have difficulty hiding it. But no matter how hard he tried, he just wasn't attracted to her. I've been around, he said quietly. I just had to get my coat back. I heard you're going to Jared's party. She set herself to rest on the stair rail. I'm going as well. If you want, we could head over there together. It would save some time and I would have someone to talk to. He winced inwardly at the thought. He liked her, and he really did. She was a wonderful person, they had such a good connection, but tying himself to her at the party? It was his first chance to do something social, and Lisa was going to be there. Typically he caved. Sure thing, I'll swing by yours Friday night and we'll walk over. She gave him a warm hug. Thank you. He tried to appear enthusiastic. Sure, no problem. He sighed as her lips met his, soft and supple. They yielded to his touch, gentle at first. The kiss was gentle, almost tender. She stopped and pulled back, looking at him in concern, leaning in to kiss him again, and he felt her soft skin. His hands reached up to brush her face with his fingers, and he withdrew it as he felt the sandpapery texture of her skin. He drew back to look at Andrew sitting in his embrace, those eyes looking at him with that same look they had when he had awoken to them in the car. They were questioning, concerned. Are you all right? Andrew asked as they sat in the back of his car, pressed up against each other. Will felt the heat of his body, but this time it wasn't about survival, it was about something more desperate. And he leaned in to kiss Andrew again. To hell with the world. Will's tongue explored that mouth hungrily, needing to be there. It was his right to be there. He felt Andrew's skin against his own. There was that smell of sweat and cologne that aroused him more than anything else in his life. He needed the comfort, the safety, and Andrew had given him that. And as they played with the kiss, he felt Andrew's hands playing on his arm, drifting gently down as they had when he had tried to warm him before, but this time it wasn't as vigorous, it was slow, as Will savored the sensation. Andrew rose slightly, not breaking the kiss, turning Will onto his back as he drew himself against the younger teenager, and Will wanted nothing more than to stay there, safe and warm beneath the man who had risked everything to save him. There was passion in those eyes, a burning need. He collapsed back to the bed, sweating, realizing he had a dream. It had felt so real, the sensations, the feelings of Andrew against his skin. He lay there panting a while, thinking about the dream and how real it had felt. He sat in quiet shock on the edge of his bed, pulling the heavy down comforter around his shoulders to keep him warm in the chill air. What the hell was that about? He shook his head trying to clear it. He had started to dream about another girl, one from a playboy he had hidden under his mattress, but why had it become Andrew? He lay back on the bed and stared up at the ceiling, hearing the cracking of the house settling, his eyes wide and fearful. Why? It was probably just the intensity of the moment, trapped in a car, desperately relying on each other to stay alive. The intimacy that came with being that close to someone for so long. That had to be it. You weren't gay if you weren't attracted to boys. And when Will asked himself if he was attracted to guys, he answered no firmly. But when he asked himself if he was attracted to Andrew Highmore, he couldn't answer it. How could he after a dream like that? No, he decided, he wasn't gay, it was just a bad dream, or good dream depending on how he looked at it. He grinned at that thought as he rolled himself over into his covers and pulled them close about him, laying staring at the red digits on his alarm clock, 6 o'clock. He would have to get up soon and go to school. But then Jared's party was tonight and he was excited about it. The party was in full swing as he pulled the front door of Jared's house closed behind him. He wasn't used to house parties and wanted some air. He was enjoying himself, there was so much happening around him and it was great to meet so many of the people he knew from school outside of that setting, in a place where they could just relax and be themselves. Jared was a great host. He had opened up the den in the basement as well as the upstairs, and a lot of the guests had split up among the various rooms. But, like every get-together he had been to in Canada, the real party was in the kitchen. Lisa had perched herself on the edge of a countertop and was feverishly discussing her opinions on the Canadian political system, trying to defend her liberal stance to a group of die-hard young conservatives. Brody seemed to have adopted the ethical high ground for the debate, injecting his own viewpoints when things became too heated. As usual, his balanced temperament and strong personality gave him an edge when it came to expressing his thoughts on what was right and wrong. Both he and Lisa seemed to be quite worked up, dominating opposite viewpoints. Will had tried to join the debate, but his glaring lack of knowledge about Canadian politics left him at a disadvantage, and he soon found he was out of his league. He had watched the two verbally spar with each other for a while, before he had found his attention wandering and he had sought some other conversation. Unfortunately, that meant Jennifer. She seemed quite morose at the party, preferring to stay close to him and trying to retain his attention while he circled the party. At first he had felt sorry for her and kept trying to draw her into the friendly conversations he was having. But she wasn't there to chat with other people, she seemed only interested when he talked to her. After an hour he felt smothered, and was desperate just to get some air for a while. He made a feeble excuse about the washroom and beat a hasty exit. He stood in the cold on Jared's front stoop, clasping his arms about him, watching his breath fog as he breathed, smelling the wonderful smells of wood smoke from one of Jared's neighbors' chimneys, and he stepped down onto the freshly cleared path. Salt crunched beneath his shoes as he walked and he smiled. He could tolerate winter in small doses, and with the Christmas season just beginning it really wasn't that bad. He glanced up the street at all the houses with their blinking Christmas lights glittering in the snow. It really was a beautiful night. He heard a sharp rasping sound followed by a clap and a thump. Curious, he crossed the street and entered the small park that sat directly across from Jared's house. He regretted not grabbing his jacket, but he was only going to be outside for a few moments, so he simply pulled his arms around himself and struggled over the steep snow bank to get a glimpse at where the noises were coming from. He stopped and smiled. The small hockey rink was really nothing more than a few boards set up around a patch of cleared ice. A group of neighborhood parents had probably set it up for their kids to play on during the day. A conveniently placed street lamp that bathed the white snow about it a soft orange lighted the ice, and Will couldn't help but smile. Andrew swept about in a wide circle, the hockey stick waving back and forth as he guided the black puck in lazy sweeps in front of him. He braked with another rasp of skates, sent the puck sailing against the boards, and it thumped dully against them as he swept in to repeat the pattern again. "Looks like fun," Will observed with a grin as he leaned on the boards watching Andrew make another pass.